So in Sunday's newscast, Laura brought us the news that Sue Gray had resigned as Keir Starmer's chief of staff to be replaced by Morgan McSweeney, all developed around Sunday lunchtime. Laura was on a moving train at the time. Chris, were you anywhere quite as glamorous?
I just got back from the swimming pool, having taken my children to their Sunday morning swimming lesson, and hadn't quite got round to sort of wringing out their costumes or whatever. But I decided to just briefly sit down to have a quick flick through the Sunday papers when suddenly my phone starts dancing away. This is about 1:45 on Sunday afternoon, suggesting something was up, with the classic tell sign journalistically that something is up at the centre of government, which is when loads of folk at the centre of government for quite a while have stopped answering calls. And you think, have they stopped? And they're often, not always, sometimes it's because it's Sunday and people have got better things to do, but often it's because the person that you are ringing knows that if they answer, you are going to ask question A, to which they would have to say answer B, because otherwise they wouldn't be telling the truth, and they can't say answer B yet because they haven't quite all the ducks in a row or whatever. And if that happens to enough of us for a long enough period of time, we can usually smell that something's up. And sure enough it was, and just before 1:00 we got the news that Sue Gray was out, and there was this sort of wider reshuffle going on in number 10.
So there was a massive reshuffle. So Sue Gray out, and in to replace her is Morgan McSweeney. Just give us a quick lowdown, Chris, if you will, on those kind of key power players, who's come and who's gone.
Yeah, and I'll be fascinated to hear Alex's take, the second Alex of Newscast for this episode, because what I'm conscious of journalistically, actually, with this sort of stuff, it's my job to try, and as it is for Alex and Alex Forsyth and other political reporters, to try and bring an understanding and a flavour of what goes on in this postcode to our audiences. But inevitably, there is a skew in political journalism towards those who are in the big P political front line. In other words, politicians and their associated advisors. And behind that, the machinery of government, which for perfectly good reasons has a bit of distance from the kind of political cut and thrust of journalists and politicians and gossip and all the rest of it, are the engine room of doing things and making things happen. And it can be quite hard for those of us who have, are career reporters to have an understanding of the subtleties and the structures and the ways that the governing machine works. And it's where the brilliant work of the Institute for Government and others can help fill lay people and indeed so that those of us journalistically who follow this sort of stuff in. But anyway, that was a long rambling non-answer, Alex, to your question, which I'm now going to address. So Morgan McSweeney has worked alongside Keir Starmer for a fair old while, long-standing kind of creature of the Labour Party, is obsessed with ensuring that the party can win, and was the mastermind behind their general election campaign, which, was for him a huge personal triumph as well as a wider team effort. But he was absolutely central to turning Labour from, a party that was crushed in 2019 to one that won in 2024. Sue Gray, by contrast, was somebody who'd spent a career in the civil service and then went to work for Labour last year. We were told she was recruited to prepare the party for government, then becomes chief of staff in Downing Street. There's then a bit of a sort of arguably an oddity in the kind of organogram of Downing Street. Well, hang on, there's this guy who's led the operation for the party to win, and then there's this person who was brought in, Sue Gray, who knows how government works and all of that. And there's clearly a logic, to that appointment, given that previous kind of career trajectory. But it didn't seem to work. And then on top of that, because Sue Gray had a public profile, courtesy of the Partygate report that she'd authored as a civil servant into the lockdown parties in Downing Street when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, she had, from her perspective, a kind of unfortunate public profile that I don't think she ever would have sought and never appeared particularly comfortable with, that probably magnified the extent to which she was a lightning rod, to mix my metaphors somewhat, meaning that when stuff started to fly, some of it perhaps fair, some of it perhaps wildly unfair, she found herself at the centre of it. And, obviously personally for her, and I say this as somebody who's been in the thick of reporting a lot of stories about her, clearly not comfortable and not easy. I've been conscious of that reporting upon her.
So obviously we're talking about Sue Gray, Chief of Staff, going, Morgan McSweeney replacing her. There's also been a new Director of Strategic Communications, 2 Deputy Chiefs of Staff, a new Principal Private Secretary. Alex, it might sound like we are just talking a lot about the kind of, as Chris says, those inner workings of Downing Street, the personalities, the people. But I guess it matters because this is about how the machinery of government works, and that affects how good or not the operation is, and crucially whether or not they can get things done. I suppose how that role of Chief of Staff is a pretty pivotal one to a smooth running of government.
Yeah, completely. And it does matter who the personalities are and how they respond to pressure. These are incredibly pressurised jobs, and so when different people will respond in different ways, and that leads to different outcomes to all of us, from the Prime Minister down. So it really matters. The Chief of Staff job, I think, particularly matters because for 2 main reasons. Partly because they are the last person in the room with the Prime Minister. So there are other civil servants, really important roles, but in the end, that's your sort of ultimate ally, the person who you bounce the really tough stuff around on and leaves you with the last person when you're making a decision. So really important that they're politically aligned and that they're completely trusted. The other reason they matter is that Prime Minister has so many demands on their time. They're doing press conferences with Chris and you, Alex, and colleagues. They're meeting foreign diplomats. They're kind of all over the place all the time. They need someone who can extend their influence into the system, who can have the conversations with special advisors in other departments, with the civil service, and say this is what the Prime Minister wants. So I think one of the reasons why we talk about the problems with Sue Gray becoming the story, one of the reasons why it was difficult for her becoming the story is to be a successful Chief of Staff, you need to be indistinguishable from the Prime Minister. We saw it as well with Dominic Cummings when he was almost carving out a separate persona from Boris Johnson. So you have to be amplifying what the Prime Minister wants across the system. And that goes a bit to Chris's point, I think, about how it actually works underneath the bonnet of Downing Street. The things that make stuff happen aren't, the briefings and the media side is really important, but it's the instructions that go out from number 10 to departments. It's the notes of meetings that are recording what the Prime Minister has agreed that actually then lead to the policy changes, the implementation, the progress chasing, all of that stuff that happens from the cockpit in number 10.
Newscast from the BBC.